against the people, and sometimes win people who are themselves workers and poor people to unity with their assessment, their characterization of the struggles of the workers and poor people. Counterinsurgency is what the U.S. and imperialist powers of parasitic capitalism does to colonize people when we fight for our freedom and independence through revolution. The heroic peoples of Vietnam, Chile, and Nicaragua, and African people in Congo, Kenya, and South Africa were among many others who bore the brunt of imperialist counterinsurgency. A counterinsurgency is a war without terms. When white people fight each other, they have the Geneva Convention defined as rules that apply in times of armed conflict and seek to protect people who are not or no longer taking part in hostilities. These include the sick and wounded of armed forces on the field, wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians. And part of the whole process of defining appropriate behavior in warfare, the terms of war, the terms of behavior during war was the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials, which has been held up with this great moral template for behavior of criminal activity, actually it didn't define itself as that. It was defined as something dealing with what had happened to the Jews. And under Germany, Nazi Germany in particular, but in various other places in Europe that were influenced by Nazi Germany. But the reality is that this thing that happened with the Jews was an instance of white people killing white people. And they had to achieve definitions of behavior, warfare, and otherwise that would set different terms for how white people would deal with white people in conflict. I can say this with confidence because the same forces that were dealing with Geneva Convention and behavior, and this is where you saw, with the Nuremberg trials, this is during the same time frame that the whole concept of genocide got thrust upon the world, and people now declared that what happened to the Jews was genocide. And in fact, the Polish Jew, Lemsky, I think his name was, the one who actually fought for and achieved this definition of genocide, made it clear that what was happening to African people in the United States did not constitute genocide. And this was a real question because, in fact, the U.S. Congress for many years would not actually support this issue of the Convention Against Genocide. But because of the possibility that it might mean African people. But Lemsky was quite clear that it had nothing to do with black people. And even as this happened in the 1940s, the brutal wars that were being made against African people all around the world by the same people who were conducting the Nuremberg trial, the lynchings that were happening even at that time in the United States government, it had nothing to do with us. It was this, we say that there are no terms. There have never been any terms that's applied. There was no Nuremberg trial for what the United States did to Vietnam. There were no Nuremberg trials for what the Belgians did to Africans in Congo. This was something that was established more or less a template for behavior of white people engaged in struggle with white people, and of the colonizer being engaged in struggle with the colonizer, of the imperialist forces being engaged in struggles among themselves over how the world is going to be dominated. So for us, the Vietnamese and other oppressed peoples around the world, there was no Nuremberg trial. This is around the same time that the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan that killed more than 100,000 people per bomb, something approximating 100,000 people per bomb. These were civilians that were being killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These were civilians that were being murdered. And this was characterized as terrorism today by white people who wanted to find the death of civilians in conflict. So anyway, there was a war without terms. There were no terms. When it comes to killing black people, no terms at all. Counterinsurgency is what the U.S. and imperialist powers of parasitic capitalism does to colonize people when we fight for our freedom and independence through revolution. The heroic peoples of Vietnam, Chile, and Nicaragua, and African people in Congo, Kenya, and South Africa were among many others who bore the brunt of imperialist counterinsurgency. A counterinsurgency is a war without terms. When white people fight each other, they have the Geneva Convention defined as rules that apply in times of armed conflict and seek to protect people who are not or are no longer taking part in hostilities. These include the sick and wounded of armed forces on the field, wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians. When they fight us, however, the Geneva Convention does not apply, and they do anything they want, including to civilians, the wounded, the sick, and prisoners of war. Almost 30 years ago, we summed up in my 1991 book, Black Power Since the 60s, the struggle against opportunism within the U.S. front of the Black Liberation Movement, and I'm quoting from that. While ever present, since our forced sojourn within this U.S. North American hell, this counterinsurgency has achieved a different character since its effective use during the Black Revolution of the 60s to destroy our movement for happiness and repossession of our stolen resources. Essentially, this counterinsurgency changed character from one which, while it attacked the whole African people, had as its primary emphasis on the destruction of specific individuals and organizations, to one which has as its primary target the entire African people, especially the revolutionary African working class. So African people have always experienced counterinsurgency. I mean, it's always been there to control the whole African population. But at a particular time, the character of the counterinsurgency was now, while dealing with keeping whole people oppressed, targeted the advanced sectors, the people and organizations and individuals who were actually out front leading this struggle. And then from that point, when they had killed Malcolm, killed Martin, destroyed the Black Panther Party, undermined the overall revolutionary leadership of the African Revolution, then it comes back to target the African working class, the whole population, but particularly African working class. And that's when drugs and things like that get pumped into the community and what have you, to make sure that the African working class is this is what the United States government did. This is what imperialism does as a rule. This is what they do all over the world. This has happened in Syria, this has happened in Afghanistan, happens all over Africa today, in every African community in the world. From Colombia to Venezuela to here in the United States, this is what happens to us. There are various components to the counterinsurgency. It employs each branch of the government and a host of state-connected institutions, as well as the bourgeois media and other instruments of mass culture controlled by the U.S. colonialist state and ruling class. Of particular significance to this discussion is the use of drugs and neo-colonialism as components of the counterinsurgency. The impact of drugs in the African community is well known, if not even exaggerated. For several years, the white ruling class media have quite selectively overwhelmed our consciousness with images of drugged out African mothers, African children who were born addicted, African illnesses and wretchedness which are due to drug use, and of course the violent African youths who are victims of and responsible for the torrent of violence and homicide that characterizes so much of our existence. Indeed, the media have consciously worked to criminalize the African community and people, mostly through manipulation of the drug issue. The selective usage of the media has defined the African in the popular consciousness. This includes too much of the African consciousness as well, as a criminal entity suffering from self-afflicted so-called ills that beset us, or as a community on the road to self-destruction. It is no longer the vicious colonial repression, as exemplified by the fact that more than a quarter of our male youth are tied to the prison system, or that the infant mortality rate within our colonized community is at least twice that for white people, or the vicious police and white citizen violence constantly directed at African people that defines our existence. It is no longer the economic exploitation that denies us work within the legal capitalist economy, while at the same time charging us more for shoddier goods, from housing and transportation to food and health care, that defines our reality. It is no longer the African oppressed by colonial white power who we are aware of, but the thankless, criminally violent, drug-addicted African who has tried the patience of civilized white society for the last time. And indeed, drugs, violence, and crime do haunt our community, but they do so as a part of a vicious U.S. government-imposed counterinsurgency that is designed to crush any attempts by our desperate people to realize national liberation, unquote. Revolution was the main trend in the world. Only our party has provided a historic and class analysis of the development of the Black Revolution of the 60s that must be understood by militants and activists attempting to interpret the state of our struggle today. Only the African People's Socialist Party has done this. One critical point is the profound correlation between the historical events occurring in Africa and other places throughout the colonial world and the freedom movement of Africans inside the United States. As I wrote in 1977 in a pamphlet, Why I Became a Revolutionary, I quote, "I'm fortunate to have been born in an era of great transformation in the world. It was a time when the basic social contradictions of this country became obvious for all to see, especially those contradictions which revolve around the so-called race question. The 1940s was also the era in which great movements against direct white rule or colonialism were occurring worldwide. In 1947, India achieved formal independence from England, and the Great Chinese Revolution occurred in 1949. Other revolutionary anti-colonial movements were sweeping Africa, Asia, and Latin America," unquote. It was this period that most determined how we understand the nature and character of our struggle today. The image and bold initiatives of Kwame Nkrumah, first president of independent Ghana, and the implacable stance of Patrice Lumumba are etched in the consciousness of all who look back at that era of universal struggle of African people. We were made confident in our road to liberation by the incorruptible visage of Malcolm X and the massive mobilizations for democratic rights organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The scenes of courageous young Africans from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the junta of militant organizations, and the Black Panther Party, to name just a few examples of the high resistance of the time, leave many Africans at a loss. Why the current lack of direction for the mass movement today? Why the absence of universal opposition to our colonial domination as a people? And this confusion is assisted by a so-called revolutionary alumni, the retired revolutionaries, that create the conditions for what has happened in our struggle to be viewed and treated as something of the past that we can all look back upon and by which we can measure the progress, in quotes, that we've made. And that's a misinformed, that's an aspect of misinformation that serves counterinsurgency. Only the African People's Socialist Party has answered these questions. The answer lay in the counterinsurgency. Bourgeois thinkers in this country have come up with, in this country I mean inside the United States, have come up with a shallow explanation for the rise of anti-colonial liberation struggles during or following both the First and Second Imperialist Wars to redivide the world. The massive phenomenon known as the Marcus Garvey movement followed on the heels of the First Imperialist World War, while the historic civil rights movement rose up in the years following the Second Imperialist War. They tell us that African soldiers and other colonial subjects. That's the imperialist pundits. That's the thinking representative of the ruling class. They tell us that the African soldiers and other colonial subjects who participated in those wars in defense of our colonial oppressors were inspired by our first glimpse of freedom when we visited other lands as soldiers for the empire. In other words, we learned what freedom was when we left the colonies and was hanging out, killing and dying for white people in Europe. And this was our inspiration, because we said, wow, this is what freedom looks like. This is the line that they put forward to us, you know. There may be some truth to the fact that many of the colonized were able to leave our neighborhoods and villages and experience the larger world for the first time since white power took over our lives. Nevertheless, an understanding of the explosive and generalized growth of the struggles for national liberation in the U.S. and around the world must be sought beyond the self-laudatory explanations of the international colonial bourgeoisie. Historically, the colonial rulers have always implored their subjects to fight their predatory wars, whether between themselves or against other colonial subjects. The British used Africans from other African colonies in their attacks against the courageous Kenyan Kenya Land and Freedom Army, or Mau Mau. The Mau Mau successfully stood up to the British Empire for many years before the brutal terroristic British counterinsurgency campaign was able to crush the heroic struggle in the 1960s. The French deployed troops from their various colonies in their vain efforts to defeat the magnificent life and freedom-affirming Vietnamese Revolution, liberating Vietnam from French colonialism. 71% of French troops fighting France's colonial war against the Vietnamese were actually subjects from Algeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and other French colonies. 71% of those who fought against Vietnam for France were people who were colonized ourselves. When the U.S. entered that war on the side of French imperialism in an attempt to maintain the colonial slavery of the Vietnamese people, it is said that 50 to 65% of the troops on the front line, that is to say, U.S. troops on the front line, were domestically colonized Africans, not to mention Mexicans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans, other forces also colonized inside the United States. This is the essence of counterinsurgency, to be able to deploy the victims of colonial imperialism to fight other victims of colonial imperialism to maintain the status quo. And right now, as we're having this discussion, there are thousands of African people in U.S. military uniforms who are roaming over Africa today, killing African people in what's supposed to be a hidden war that's becoming more and more made to the surface in the interest of white power right now. So as their own brothers and sisters are being killed inside the United States and gentrified out of existence, etc., Africans who have come from this country in the U.S. uniforms are in places all over Africa killing black people in the interests of U.S. imperialism. And other Africans inside on the continent of Africa are also engaged in the same struggle for white power, killing African people following the leadership of an African petty bourgeois neo-colonial class that would do anything to stay in power and to serve its white masters. It is true that the participation of Africans and other colonial subjects in these imperialist wars did introduce thousands of us to contemporary military training and the invaluable experience of fighting under enemy fire without panic. For example, some of you saw the video tape of this brother in Dallas, Texas, who fought the U.S. soldiers, who had U.S. cops, who had killed some of the cops during a Black Lives Hands Up, Don't Shoot kind of demonstration in Dallas, Texas. His name was Micah X, is that how he characterized himself as Micah X? And you saw this brother moving. This was somebody who was accustomed. He was a former participant in U.S. military armed forces. And the confidence that he moved in this struggle with them, you could see the confidence that he had. He had been somebody who'd been under fire before. And this was the benefit of the U.S. training that he got, the training that he got fighting for the imperialists. He was now able to bring that training back. And that's why we say that this is, a part of what may have resulted in a much more effective military confrontation with imperialist white power that the imperialists did not intend for us to have. This aided in the anti-colonial armed struggle being waged in our own interests against our colonial oppressors. Participation in the U.S. wars also served to destroy the colonial myth of the courage and indestructibility of the white man, and even provided legal opportunities for actually killing him. White men could die at the hand of a lowly nigger. They could scream in pain, just like an African being burned to death by a white lynch mob in the U.S. This was instructive. The greatest value of the Second Imperialist World War for the struggle against colonialism, however, is the fact that the imperialist bandits who were in fierce struggle against each other to redivide the world meaning us and our lands, were unable to give our oppression their usual ruthless attention. The war had left many of the colonial powers exhausted and preoccupied. In some cases, the imperialists actually required the colonized to take on some of the colonial responsibilities previously in the sole control of the colonizer. All of this provided us political space that we, the colonized everywhere, used to organize against our oppressors. This is where you see the significance, real significance of the First and Second Imperialist World Wars, not because we got to learn from the white man what freedom really means, but because of the space that we attained, the experience we got in fighting, to be able to move outside of the narrow spaces, the colonial spaces that we had been locked into. Inside the U.S., thousands of African people risked their lives and limbs fighting in the First Imperialist War for the interests and freedoms of white people, only to be targeted upon return to the U.S. with lynchings, Jim Crow, unspeakable violence, and assault by those same white people after the war. Africans and colonized people worldwide faced a similar situation. As the fever for independence swept the colonial world, hungry for our own freedom and independence following the war, more than 11 million African people here and around the world flocked to the African National Liberation Movement led by Marcus Garvey. British colonial subjects inside England created real class struggle. With the end of the Second Imperialist War, the world economy changed hands from the British, who up to that time controlled 25% of the world's population and territory, to those of the U.S. The myth of British tea-sipping white civility as the imperialist-in-chief was destroyed by the German bombing of London and other cities in England, and by rising struggles for national liberation inside British colonies. Out of desperation following the war, the British made a call to their colonial subjects from throughout the world to quote-unquote come home, to rebuild England, thereby growing a domestic or internal colony similar to that in the U.S. Soon thousands of colonial workers were recruited to relocate to Africa, to England, to England, to be exploited in the process of reconstructing the former colonial power that now lay in ruins. This influx of Africans and South Asians into the imperialist center initiated real class struggle that ruptured the facade of class peace. Previously, the unity of British workers with their ruling class had made it unnecessary to arm the British police. The internal class struggle in England had been smothered by the abundance of colonial booty, that filled markets and dinner tables and urban department stores and provided holidays and home ownership for workers and the bourgeoisie alike. Class struggle was also muted by the transfer of excess white populations to the resource generating far reaches of the empire: Southern Africa, Kenya, India, Australia, Canada. Today, the British do not boast so loudly of a pacifist police department. Increasingly, the armed British police force inside England is no different from the arm of the state called the Army when it is deployed in Kenya, Nigeria, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, South Africa, India, and Ireland. The United Kingdom is a lot less united today as a consequence of the importation of labor and class struggle from the British colonies. I think it's really important to understand that when we look at what we call the United Kingdom, we look at the unity of the so-called European Union, and we see fissures in this unity. It's not just something that suddenly the white people decided that they didn't like unity as much as they did before. The thing is that the entire unity that they have or have had has rested upon the exploitation of various peoples from around the world. And as this struggle for our freedom intensifies, then it means that the pie that they've been able to share that unified them is now becoming smaller and smaller, and it has resulted in intensification of the fight among the Europeans and even among the British for their share, what they consider their fair share. And sometimes when they say their fair share, they mean they're talking about in terms of vacation time, they're talking about in terms of retirement funds, they're talking about in terms of various privileges of free health care that they have been able to experience as a consequence of living a life atop the exploitation and severe exploitation that can only come about as a consequence of severe oppression of the colonized peoples, and certainly of Africa. While many colonies were able to win nominal independence through people's struggles in the years following the Second Imperialist War, imperialist powers retained economic and political domination over African people. The imperialist strategy of neo-colonialism, or white power in blackface, carried out by the African and colonized petty bourgeoisie, proved to be an essential tool of counterinsurgency. Class force had worked in the rise of the civil rights movement. The U.S. did not suffer the consequences of the war being fought within the domestic borders, its domestic borders, and became the center of the capitalist world economy. This is reflected in what is known as the Bretton Woods Conference, the 1944 United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which established the World Bank and International Monetary Fund that relocated the center of the world capitalist financial system to the United States. This is the Bretton Woods. You've heard of the Bretton Woods Conference before, but this is the agreement that happened in the world that switched the center of the world monetary system under capitalism from England to the United States. The European imperialist powers were now forced to share with the United States their previously dominated markets and resources from their colonial bounty. You remember, if you watched like mafia movies, and I remember, what was it, the movie The Godfather, and everybody's sitting down around the table, all the gangsters, all the mobsters, I guess from the US, sitting around the table, and they are talking with Don Corleone, who is a pretty big wig among mafia chieftains. And they are saying, you know, like, we want to start doing drugs and what have you. And, you know, you've got the judges, and you've got, you know, all these other forces, you know, et cetera, you know, and you can make it possible for us to do it. They want to come to a new arrangement because drugs were not permitted as long as Corleone had something to do with it. And of course, Corleone said, well, he said, no, you know, doing drugs and that this is something that should be left to the darkest. Let them do the drugs, you know, but we don't deal with the drugs thing. And so they didn't like that. Some of them didn't like that, and they began to conspire. And of course, the Don gets shot, you know. The mafia doesn't get destroyed, but they want to have a new deal, a new setup, so they can devise a new means. And not only that, there were some who, from the Corleone family, who wanted to deal with drugs as well. So the point is that there's a whole new deal that, the imperialist powers are no different from this kind of arrangement. In Berlin, 1884-85, where they shared out Africa among themselves. And then what we had is they sharing the world out among themselves. The world economy, how are we going to dominate? This is the same time frame that we're looking at the rise of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the United Nations. These are all arrangements for world domination by capitalist imperialist powers. The United Nations is supposed to be for all this peace. It is for peace. Just like the deals that the mafia would make and say, well, okay, this is how we're going to split it up. And this is how it's going to happen. They do that to keep peace among the mafia groupings. And so to control the world and so that we don't have to fight each other, we create this democratic institution that we call the United Nations. Is for peace. And so how we can peacefully, imperialist powers, dominate the rest of the world, set it up in a way that the organization is so totally undemocratic that the ones who are on the top of this thing can nullify anything that the majority of the people want to do and set the terms for whatever's going to happen. And that's only been affected most recently by one or two other so-called countries being able to join this elite group on the top. That's how the whole operation works. And then they have their own armed forces. Some of them are called UN peacekeepers that are killing black people in Haiti, even as we have this discussion, that helped to kill Lumumba in Congo in 1961. And then there is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a group of them have decided that they are going to protect the whole setup by quarantining and controlling what was then called Soviet Russia, that seemed to be aligned with oppressed people around the world trying to break out of this whole system that they have set up. This was the world order that they created, and this is what has been characterized as the Atlanticist bloc. This group of people, this group of forces, imperialist powers that came up with this are called the Atlanticists. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, United Nations, etc. And this is the thing, the world order that is being disrupted right now by Donald Trump, because there are a group of them for whom the crisis represents itself in such a severe way. They want to break out of these relationships, and they want to set up new deals, new trade relationships. They say they are, down with NATO. This is what Trump has come up with, down with the United Nations. Remember, that was primary to Trump's campaigning and against these other kinds of wars. He is looking at a new world order, and the ones who are in place now are now ganged up to make sure that he cannot succeed in doing this, not because they love democracy, as they would have us believe, not because they think the Russians had something to do with intervening in the elections. It's because they have a world order that is beneficial and has proved beneficial for 70 years now. And then Trump is moving, and Trump is not an individual. Believe me. He is not an individual. I mean, he is individualistic, and as capitalists and white people tend to be, but he is representing a host of powerful economic interests in the whole world. And so that's part of what we're looking at, and I'm talking too much. Extemporaneously, I think that's what you call it. So the European imperialist powers were now forced to share with the U.S. their previously dominated markets and resources from their colonial booty. So they want to bring in the drugs, and they come to the Don, and now they're forced to share with the Don, right? Raw materials from the colonies that were opened up to U.S. exploitation began to generate a critical need for U.S. workers to transform them into finished products. Workers from Eastern Europe, having become a part of the Soviet bloc after the war, were no longer available to the U.S. as in the past. It's where they would bring in workers to fill in the factories and what have you. And at one time, Hungary, part of Eastern Europe, was created a supply of workers. You see this rush from Europe and Eastern Europe into the United States to fill up the factories and things like that. And they were considered really important workers. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were looking to Eastern Europeans where they were educated because they got educated through the workers' governments and economies that allowed them to have decent and quality education more than the workers, African workers and Mexicans and other colonized workers inside the United States. And they were white, which would presume them to be safe in the United States, to integrate into the greater white population, which is why you can go to a department store in this country and run into somebody in the U.S., when I say this country, who can barely speak English, who've come from Albania or some other place because they're white, they're safe, they don't disrupt the thing, they can integrate into the white population as a part of the efforts, the need to keep African people under subjugation. So now with the success of the Russian Revolution and the creation of what they call the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc that included much of Eastern Europe, now these workers, you can't get these workers. And so when the workers were coming here, this is where the term hunky comes from. This is what the white workers were calling Hungarian hunkies, who were taking their jobs and other kinds of stuff like that. I mean, I know that we seem to have inherited the African movement, the concept of the term, but hunkies was something that white people created to fight other white people. The bourgeois solution for the U.S. worker shortage was located in the southern states among the domestically colonized African working class. This is when they couldn't get them from the Soviet bloc, then they this is really important for us to understand in terms of some of what we're looking at today, because they can get them from what used to be the Soviet bloc now. They can get them from Albania. They can get them from what used to be Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe and what have you. And that has severe implications for African people and our ability to move in a certain way in terms of the economy in this country, because they don't have to do what they did then. And then what they had to do, we say that their solution for the U.S. worker shortage was located in the southern states among the domestically colonized African working class. It's important to understand this because you have Africans who now talking about the Mexicans are coming to take our jobs and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And why would they say the Mexicans are coming to take their jobs? When the Hungarians took your jobs, in quotes, the Albanians take your jobs, in quotes. That's an Albanian that could call security when you ask too many questions about how you charge in the department store. You're not saying the Albanians took our jobs, because the Albanians are white and the Mexicans are not. And there's an assumption that white people will dominate and can move any kind of way that Mexicans and others can't. And we don't recognize that the white people enjoy a particular relationship to this economy that the Mexicans, like you, do not enjoy. And that we can get played against each other as Mexicans, as Africans, as indigenous peoples, etc., while the white person sits atop this entire thing and have us fighting against racism or some stupidity like that, even as they enjoy the fruits of our labors and our struggles. The problem was that the relations of production in the South required Africans to be tied to the intense, back-breaking toil associated with the labor-intensive capitalism in jobs such as sharecropping, mining, and agricultural work. The Southern-based, labor-intensive colonial capitalist system was opposed to any kind of change that might challenge its profit and domination and the existing relations of production that protected it. These relations of production were justified by the ideology of white nationalism, which had used terrorist violence for its perpetuation since the earliest days of our enslavement on southern plantations in the United States. It was for these reasons that African laborers were denied the right to the minimum education that would be necessary for the workers in the capitalist-intensive production in northern factories. This is why the liberal U.S. bourgeoisie supported the nonviolent efforts to legalize education and basic civil rights for the oppressed African workers in the South. The apartheid regime in South Africa was influenced by and built on the same relations of production that existed within the U.S., where Africans were totally disenfranchised and defined as subhuman. There was such a thing as nigger work that placed restrictions on where Africans could work and what we were permitted to do within those workspaces. Separate toilets, drinking fountains, and neighborhoods were also used to define Africans as less human than the North Americans or whites who set the standard for human identity. And this is really important. I was in the U.S. military. My daddy warned me against this stupidity of mine, but I thought I was escaping this southern existence in St. Petersburg, Florida, to go out and see the world or something like that. And I was fortunate. I did see the world, and that was helpful. But I was stationed in Fort Benning, Georgia, after leaving Berlin, Germany, where this intensification of the contradiction between the Soviet Union and the U.S. was really heating up. And I got to Berlin, Germany, and I went to a snack bar on the post. I mean, I got to Fort Benning, Georgia. And I went to a snack bar on the post. And there's a white woman who worked. She was a worker at a snack bar on the military post. This is no educated, this is not the bourgeoisie. This is a worker at a damn snack bar. She ran the snack bar. She took the money and gave the stuff for the snack bar. But here's the significance of the philosophy that we're talking about, because when I would go and buy stuff from the snack bar, this white woman, seeing herself as so superior and Africans as this horribly subhuman entity that might even be contagious, when I would pay her the money, she would refuse to, she would move her hand so that my hand wouldn't accidentally touch her hand when I was giving her the money. Yeah. So she would move her hand, and every instant she would move her hand so that I found I would stick it in her hand anyway, right? So I was called before the sergeant major that on the whole post to say that this woman said that I was trying to hold her hand. This white woman said I was trying to hold her hand. This is at best you can characterize her as a worker. In the white world, she was a damn sub worker. You understand what I mean? She is working at the damn snack bar on the military base, right? And she couldn't touch my hand because she was too good for that. And that's something that affected the consciousness of her and affected the consciousness of African people as well. And that's like that mural that was on the wall here in St. Petersburg, Florida, that I got a 5-year prison sentence for snatching it down, that depicted Africans in this subhuman caricature that actually justified how white people treated and thought about African people, and also reinforced the subservience of black people, this thing that would be hanging 8 by 10 foot mural hanging at the seat of power and of governmental power in this city. So this ideological thing is really powerful, much more potent than most people understand it to be. So these separate toilets, drinking fountains, and neighborhoods were used to define Africans as less human than the North Americans or whites who set the standards for human identity. And so here's a white woman. And this would have been 62, 63, which is, I'm saying this to make a statement about the state of white womanhood, even pre-bourgeois feminist, woman, and she, at least she's white, though. You understand? And this is the thing that from where she got the essence of her identification, because she wasn't one of us. So, the colonial state, which included the white population in the South, also initiated deadly prohibition on all social interactions between, especially sexual, between the colonizer and the colonized, essentially between African men and North American women. These deadly prohibitions involved massive government-sanctioned lynchings, human burnings, torture, white mob attacks, destroying whole African towns, rape, and general degradation of African people, for which, as of the 1950s, no white perpetrator was ever prosecuted, because they were popular arms of the colonial state. And that's something that really must be understood, and we don't have enough time. And we don't, you know, I hope before I die that, you know, I really would like to talk and write about this, because how the typical Marxists and so-called progressives and leftists and socialists understand the question of the state, and even how Marx and Engels themselves understood the question of the state, and the whole notion of, is there such a thing as a people's state, which seems to be, for those who deal with the scientific definition of the state, it seems to be oxymoronic to say a people's state, because the state itself is an instrument that's used to protect the interests of the ruling class. So you can't say it's the people's state, right? But there is and was a people's state. It was a white people's state that employed the majority of white people as arms to maintain the colonial domination of Africans and other oppressed peoples around the world. It was white people, not just some specialized fixed or permanent armed force that was doing what they did to us in Kenya, or what they do even in Israel, where all the white people learn how to shoot and kill, and where they go into the military now in Israel at a certain age, but they still do it in places like South Africa, Rhodesia, and in this country. We saw this, and we see it even today. Even this whole thing about what they call it, how do they define this, about gun control, is a white people state thing, even though a sector of the white population is totally opposed to it, because they understand the state also, but they see the state as being an instrument that advances the interests of a certain sector correctly in that instance. But that this whole gun control thing, gun control already exists in the United States. That's what do they call it? Stop and frisk. Yeah. It's all about gun control. Yeah. That's why the big things that you see up in communities, big billboards saying, turn in your guns and we'll give you some groceries, starving African. It's gun control. Everything that you see happen is the whole struggle for black people, and only for black people, and only for Mexicans, and only for the indigenous people of nonviolence. That's pump all the time. That's gun control. It happens physically, it happens politically, ideologically, and even psychologically against us, so that you have to be for nonviolence until you join their army. Right? Or until you fighting and killing from them on the police force, you have to be for nonviolence. Nonviolence is something that is perpetrated, that's imposed like a weapon, like on the oppressed and colonized people. A crude but generally accepted ideologically backward definition of African humanity was a logical expression of the economic base of a slavery-generated social system. It is a definition that prevails up to this day, not only for Africans within the U.S., but for Africans in general, all of whom were brought into a relationship with Europe through the global colonial slavery-related economy. Nor is this backward ideological assumption restricted to what are generally regarded as reactionary Klan, Boers, or fascist type of Europeans or whites. We're talking here about the ideological foundation of capitalism that permeates all of Europe, other capitalist-dominated societies, and essentially the entire world. Happy Christian families, liberals, and cookie-cutting grandmothers all embraced this ideology and carried out this violence. African workers attempting to leave the U.S. South for the capitalist-intensive production of the North often had to do so under extremely dangerous circumstances. In many instances, Africans risked their lives to acquire the education necessary for laborers in capitalist-intensive production. These contradictions led to the alliance between members of the liberal sector of the colonial bourgeoisie, as represented by U.S. Senator and Vice President Hubert Horatio Humphrey, and former U.S. Presidents John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the liberal colonized African petty bourgeoisie. Both needed change and access to African workers, but for entirely different reasons. Both needed a revolution from above that would not overturn the entire colonial capitalist system. And this is something, this discussion that we're having right now, really disturbs a sector of the African petty bourgeoisie, African liberals who really want to, despite everything that you say, they want to have warm feelings for U.S. colonial President Johnson and Kennedy, old Jack, who had his head blown off by a sector of, by the state in some kind of intra-colonial, intra-capitalist contradiction. I mean, there are actually Negroes who, right now, some of them, feeling upset and disturbed, even if only mildly so, and because we are defining a real material, we're giving a real materialist definition of this contradiction in reality, and it's not something that subscribes to the romantic, idealistic assumption of the good white guys who, sacrificed everything for black people. The African working class, perennial victims of this terror and arbitrary, extra-legal, and often very subjective, personalized violence, desperately needed relief from this situation. And that was one of the things about the South, in particular. But you saw that when they killed Eric Garner. I mean, you see a real personalized. This is not just some objective murder, brutality that you can see, people committing against. This is very personalized. Where they pushed his head into the concrete, when they cut off people's genitals and fingers for. This is personal, real desperate, deep, personalized kind of violence that's directed against African people. We wanted to be able to see a future where our children would not be locked into indeterminate, relentless brutality with poverty and backbreaking nigger work. The colonized liberal African petty bourgeoisie also needed democratic changes for its own protection from this arbitrary extrajudicial treatment. Even petty bourgeois educated and otherwise assimilated Africans were subjected to the vicious whims of uncultured, uneducated, reactionary whites who functioned as extensions of the white colonial state in their treatments of Africans. In fact, that's where you saw, the Africans, petty bourgeoisie got a big car, nicer than the average white guy has got, and seemed to be successful, Dr. So-and-so, this uneducated tobacco-chewing cracker who lived in the South, watching this Negro parade up and down and with his family and dressed nicely and what have you. That Negro is subject to become the next target that they're going to have to kill because he has stepped out, he's an uppity nigger, and etc. And that's why even today, when you see an African driving a big car in an urban area that we're looking at, that African's going to be stopped. That African's going to catch hell from the police, etc., because you're not supposed to have that. Additionally, the selfish interests of the African petty bourgeoisie required mass access to the electoral process as a means of acquiring an ability to integrate into the capitalist economic system, which is the definition of equality for the African petty bourgeoisie, to be able to integrate into the capitalist economic system. That's what it is. And sometimes we get fed this nonsense as workers from the African petty bourgeoisie whose aspiration is just to be able to get a piece of the action. But the African working class is the responsibility of the party to help the African working class to know and understand that all the action they're getting a piece of is your action. It's coming as a consequence of your life, your freedom, your aspirations, and everything that African people have created. They needed the African masses to have the ability to vote so they, the African petty bourgeoisie, could be elected to office and positions of power to integrate into the capitalist system as co-predators. They were looking to become co-predators. And they needed me to be able to vote so they could get elected. Not so that something could happen for me, but so they could get elected. And that's why they never talk about me except in generalized terms and in a way that's going to benefit them and not me. They can't even speak specifically and definitively about my condition. They can't even say black community control of the police. Not just community control, black community control of the police. They cannot say that y'all are terrorizing black people. We need reparations, not some poverty program that has the name reparation, but a genuine program that would elevate the conditions of African people as a people, right? They can't say that. So they needed to have the African masses have the ability to vote so that they, the African petty bourgeoisie, could be elected to office and positions of power to integrate into the capitalist system as co-predators. These petty bourgeois forces became the burgeoning neo-colonialists. Listen, when we say that they needed these things, We're not saying that that's what they promoted. We're not even saying that every one of them was conscious of it. But they were conscious of not saying and raising up anything that was going to benefit the African working class as a class and black people as a people. Not as a people defined by them, but I'm talking about the actual African people who now occupy something like half the prison population of this country. You don't hear them saying anything about that except in general abstract terms. They don't say that the police is a standing arm in our community and that they are used for the purpose of filling up the prisons and doing other things in order as a form of colonial domination. You can't get them to say that. We can. And that's the kind of movement that has to be built. Many had no neo-colonialist aspirations. Often they merely wanted to be part of the existing setup. Some, suffering severe self-alienation, just wanted to be with white people. This revolution from above that we have come to know as the civil rights movement was funded by the liberal white ruling class, liberal white colonial rulers. This explains why the movement had to be based on philosophical nonviolence. The white rulers were not about to fund a movement that would engage in armed resistance to white terror that might destroy our colonial domination. Trying to be conscious of the time. I got to read faster now. I know I've been sort of off the books a lot. I would like for us to get through the first half of this if I can. So I'm going to try to be more expeditious. As we analyzed in the book, East Way Late to Africa, the political report to our third Congress back in 1990, quote, the alliance between the liberal oppressor and the liberal oppressed was an alliance which required a limited or partial revolution. This partial revolution would result in the oppressed African working masses being able to sell our exploited labor to the liberal bourgeoisie and would give access to electorally gain white power to the African primitive petty bourgeoisie. Along with the natural aspirations of the oppressed, domestically colonized African people for national liberation, this was the real political and economic basis for the civil rights movement that mobilized and gave consciousness to millions of African people throughout the U.S. and around the world. This was the real political and economic basis for the heroic resistance of the wretched, toiling African masses of the South. Both the white liberal oppressors and the oppressed African petty bourgeoisie were determined to obscure the actual material basis for the struggle known as the civil rights movement and the real stakes that were involved. Both were determined to keep the masses of African people convinced that we were struggling to change the feelings of white people toward Africans, or that we were fighting for the right to live with the white oppressor nation, U.S. North American population. Thus, a purely idealistic ideological cover was given to our struggle by the liberal African primitive petty bourgeoisie. We were not told that we must be committed to philosophical nonviolence because we were involved in a limited revolution designed to serve the interests of the liberal sector of our colonial oppressors who would never support a genuine revolution of our oppressed people. Instead, we were told that such a philosophical commitment to nonviolence was morally cleansing and empowering. However, there was always an undercurrent of resistance to the philosophical idealism, tactics, strategies, and political objectives of the liberal African primitive petty bourgeoisie from the broad perimeter of the Black liberation movement. Much of this resistance came from the masses of oppressed African working people who sometimes participated in the movement despite these differences, unquote. The problem for the white rulers and their compliant African minions was the fact that the fodder for this movement, the impoverished and brutalized Africans of the southern U.S., would discover our own interests in the struggle for the democracy being sought by the liberals, colonizer, and colonized alike. In the struggle to change the world, these African toilers will ourselves be changed. We summed up in the article Advanced Detachment, written for the Burning Spear in 1985, and which appears in the book Omali Yeshitela Speaks, Quote, during the 1950s, the alliance between our movement and the liberal bourgeoisie consolidated itself in mass struggle. In the process, our movement began to achieve a revolutionary character. This movement activated the African victims of U.S. colonialism as conscious participants and impacted on the consciousness of and practical life of all the people inside the U.S. This powerful movement overthrew the immediate form of capitalist rule of the Southern white ruling class and achieved legal democratic rights for African people, unquote. The rise of the conscious African working class. The need for change was aptly summed up by the statement by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in its slogan demand for Black Power, coming in 1966 after the petty bourgeois-led civil rights movement had realized its aims with the enactment of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The outcome of the alliance was something that neither the liberal bourgeoisie nor the black petty bourgeoisie could predict, namely the emergence of an African proletariat rising up from the bowels of America itself, as we observed in the advanced detachment. While the selfish interests of the African working class proved to be in contradiction with the aims of colonial white power, they were in contradiction with the interests and aims of the black petty bourgeoisie as well. We noted again in advanced detachment, quote, an inconsistent though generally materialist philosophy of black nationalism began to emerge out of the aims of the African working class. Black nationalism began to reject the idealist and obscurantist philosophy of the liberal black petty bourgeoisie. Martin Luther King's dream of a better day in America as a consequence of the moral regeneration of whites of the oppressor nation was challenged by the nightmare as defined by Malcolm X. The African proletariat facing objective reality in America raised the demand for black power to determine our own reality, unquote. Indeed, the Black Power slogan demand captured the reality for the entire African nation within the U.S. and the world. Inside the U.S. during this period, every African community was literally on fire with rebellion and anti-colonial resistance. It was an anti-colonial demand that challenged the limitation of the call for equality and rights within the colonial relationship. The Black Power demand gave a taste of political power to the masses of African people everywhere. As we continue in advanced detachment, quote, for the new generation of fully mobilized African workers that was thrust into the scene as the main social factors in U.S. political life, its aspirations were far from being met by gaining bourgeois democratic rights. The attempts by the petty bourgeoisie to moderate the black liberation movement, to decelerate it and direct it towards liberal bourgeois democratic sops were met with cries of "burn, baby, burn" in Los Angeles and Black Power in Mississippi. At this point, the independent aspirations of the African working class became clear. This new clarity fueled efforts to build independent political parties by and for the colonially oppressed African population, unquote. We explained further in the 1998 presentation that we call The Wolf and the Double-Edged Blade, published in Omali Yeshitela Speaks, quote, our movement emerged as an anti-colonial movement at the moment the issue became one of power. When African workers said black power, they united with struggles like the ones being led by Che Guevara throughout Latin America and Africa. In 1967, we saw the rise of the Black Panther Party, which took the struggle even further. The Black Panther Party was immediately and explicitly informed and influenced by Malcolm X, who told us that since it's legal to have a shotgun, every African should have one in his or her house. With the emergence of the Black Panther Party, we saw tremendous anxiety in this country, so much so that J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the executive director of the FBI, which is one of the secret political police agencies in this country, characterized the Black Panther Party as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States since the Civil War. Not Gaddafi, not Saddam Hussein, not the Russians, but ordinary African working class folk, most of whom lived in housing projects and had to use public transportation to get from one part of the city to the other. That's a statement about where power can be found. in the masses of African workers and poor people who, given organization and ideological clarity, can achieve anything. That's the thing that Hoover and the FBI recognized. Unfortunately, not too many of our leaders today recognize that. We know that the Black Revolution, once unleashed, gave rise to virtually every other progressive entity that sprung up in this country. It was the Black Revolution that took white women out of the kitchen and homosexuals out of the closet. It was the Black Revolution that energized the movement of other oppressed peoples, including indigenous people in this country. It was a powerful and profound movement that shook this country to its very foundation. This is why the government put in place a program to cut down and undermine the Black Revolution and assassinate our leaders. They created what we refer to as counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency uses every form of attack: psychological warfare, actual armed struggle, economic warfare. The name of the government's counterinsurgency against the Black Revolution was COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. COINTELPRO was the program used to assassinate and imprison our leaders and destroy our organizations. And we would have been more accurate to have said the name of one of the best, certainly of the best known counterinsurgency program was COINTELPRO, because there were others that were initiated by the CIA in particular, and which we hear less about because the CIA is supposed to be an instrument of the state that's used essentially outside of the country, but it was used against us in this country. And there were other arms of military intelligence and what have you that we had to contend with in the 1960s. Imperialist violence sets back our anti-colonial struggle. The COINTELPRO objectives spelled out in this August 25th, 1967 memorandum sent by the FBI to field officers throughout the U.S. is telling in its slander, lies, and efforts to criminalize and set the Black Revolution up for violence and assault. And I'm quoting now from this, the objectives that the FBI established for counterintelligence program. Quote, the purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of Black nationalist hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder. Yeah, it's a point. You know, like, I was one of them. I was one of what they characterize as, we call them Kiwis, key black extremists or something like that. Targeted even at that point. And JOMO and the other organizations, the party subsequent to that, were also targeted by the intelligence organizations. So the activities of all such groups of intelligence interest to the Bureau must be followed on a continuous basis so that we will be in a position to promptly take advantage of all opportunities for counterintelligence and inspire actions in instances where circumstances warrant. The pernicious background of such groups, their duplicity and devious maneuvers must be exposed to public scrutiny where such publicity will have a neutralizing effect. Efforts of the various groups to consolidate their forces or to recruit new or youthful adherents must be frustrated. No opportunity should be missed to explore through counterintelligence techniques the organizational and personal conflicts of the leadership of the groups, and where possible, an effort should be made to capitalize upon existing conflicts between competing Black nationalist organizations. When an opportunity is apparent to disrupt or neutralize Black nationalist hate-type organizations through the cooperation of established local news media contacts or through such contacts with sources available to the seat of government, which was Hoover's office, in every instance, careful attention must be given to the proposal to ensure the targeted group is disrupted, ridiculed, and discredited through the publicity and not merely publicized, unquote. So I'm on page 82 now, and I'm short of where I wanted to be now, but which means that we'll have to be much more expeditious on the second half of this. But I'd like to stop now so that we can entertain some discussion that I think is really important for us to do. Uhuru, Director Akile.
Uhuru, let's give our chairman a round of applause for that amazing study. Uhuru, and I really want to appreciate you, Chairman. This has been a very, very dynamic discussion. And I want to encourage everybody right now who's tuned in via Facebook and YouTube to go ahead and write your questions, comments for discussion. Chairman has given us a little bit of time to talk about, you know, this part one of this chapter, which was, everything has been really, really informative, and really just appreciate the analysis. I want to shout out some people who are watching. Sorry if I've mispronounced this. Nyakwar says Uhuru from Nairobi, and Imkas says Uhuru Chairman tuning in from Nairobi. We have Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela, who made this statement earlier when you were giving the self-criticism at the beginning, saying, Uhuru, if one cannot make a self-criticism, one will never be able to grow and develop. Thank you, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. We have Guy Robert Delani Ejuma, says Uhuru from Cameroon in Africa. Comrade Abdullah Alexander in Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, says, I appreciate our chairman's thorough grasp of history, which gives him the ability to expose and reveal the hidden hands that are responsible for the misery that Africans face in this nation and around the world. Uhuru, that was a keen analogy between, and talking about the mob and Western powers. So that was from Comrade Abdullah in Springfield, Illinois. And we have someone named Ra asked where are we located. They moved from San Antonio to Satellite Beach, Florida, and they said they want to link up with comrades in Florida. So anybody who's on the live right now, especially from the southern region, if y'all could reach out to this brother Ra, who's says he wants to connect. So I'm looking for questions right now. We have a bunch of platforms to look at, so but no questions have come in, just different comments and things right now. So don't know if you had anything else, Chairman.
Yeah, I just want to say that it would be hard to overstate the intervention in our movement, our struggle by these intelligence organizations to try to destroy our movement. And it's an ongoing process. It's not something that ever goes away. Like, so you hear, this is an error that's being made when somebody says, well, COINTELPRO, they've ended COINTELPRO. Formally, they no longer have something called COINTELPRO. Well, whether they have something called COINTELPRO or not is not the case. You cannot have a colonized population like Africans. You cannot have a colonized population like the Mexicans. You cannot have the indigenous people living in concentration camps that they call reservations. You cannot have half the African population or half the prisoners in this country be African people and not employ all the time all kinds of efforts and means to maintain that relationship. You can't have an economy that's based on being able to extort and otherwise take the resources of the majority of the people for a minority to be able to live at its benefit. You can't do that without counterinsurgency. Every tool, every vicious tool, and you think about it, you're talking about it's an inherently unjust system. And I say unjust, I mean this is a term that I use and you would use, et cetera, but it's more than just some abstract terminology that we're involved in. Because the fact is that the people who benefit from this don't call it unjust. White people in general do not think that America is unjust or that the social system is unjust. They think we are weird. They think we are the ones who are disrupting everything. So we talk about unjust. We have to remember what we are dealing with is a social system. It's not just some people like you and don't like you. What we have to remember is that the most profound contradiction that we're looking at in the whole world is the contradiction between oppressed and oppressor nations. And so this is the main contradiction. Now, all other kinds of contradictions that exist. This is where the silliness that's called, what do they call it? Some kind of intersectionalism and stuff comes from, because it recognizes that oppression happens and exploitation happens on a lot of different levels. It does happen like that. They do happen like that on a lot of different levels, but the thing is that there is a main contradiction around which all the others revolve, upon which all the others require for their existence. And this main contradiction is the relationship between oppressed and oppressor nations. Why? Because the oppressor nations achieve dominance and superiority in all the resources they get as a consequence of creating oppressed nations from whom they can steal everything. And so you have this relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor nation. It doesn't mean that once this relationship is established that everything is not static in the oppressed nation and the oppressor nation. The fact is there's a dynamic relationship that exists even within the oppressor nation. There's a dynamic relationship. There's the oppression and exploitation that happens on top of this pedestal of oppression of the majority of the people of the world. So yes, white women do get exploited and oppressed upon this foundation of the oppression of the peoples of the world. And white workers do get exploited within that narrowly defined relationship of within the oppressor nation. So yes, you can say workers are exploited, colonial workers, colonizer workers are exploited. Yes, they're exploited if you limit the discussion to what happens within, upon the pedestal. Then you can't say, however, that the colonized workers and the colonizer workers, all of the workers on this pedestal are part of the colonizer nation. They colonize the rest of us. And so what they might consider paltry in terms of their return for their labor and stuff like that is incredible when compared to what is happening to the colonized worker. So that the colonizer, people of the colonizer nation, they think of justice in a way that's entirely different from those of us who are colonized. But this is not purely semantical, and I think that we have to say that there is such a thing as objective truth. Even though you have this truth that comes from the colonizer, and then there's this truth that's expressed, that's realized by the colonized. There is an objective truth. It's not that you just pick your truth and say, I want to be with this one as opposed to the other one. Once you understand that the primary contradiction is this relationship that exists between the colonized and the colonizer, then you know where to go for objective truth and how you can define what is really happening within the colonizer nation as compared to what's happening within the colonized nation. I don't know if that was clear or not, but I think it's really important for us to understand. Uhuru.
And just a comment that I thought was really important, because comrades here from St. Pete and in the southern region, they are currently in Selma right at this moment for what they call Bloody Sunday. And this is a comment from Olafin saying that Uhuru chairman, we are in Selma playing the study on loudspeakers, and I thought it was really important to mention because, you know, it's this whole weekend of festivities that's going on that's really been organized by the petty bourgeoisie, and even to the extent that they were honoring Hillary Clinton this weekend, you know, at one of their events as a part of this celebration. So I wanted to...
I think that's important. I'm glad that Africans have come out in great numbers for the commemoration of what they call Bloody Sunday, where African civil rights forces were brutalized and brutally, you know, beaten and crushed in Selma, Alabama. I think it's the Pettus Bridge, something Pettus Bridge, where that happened. And but what happens too often, just as what we see with what they call Juneteenth. The Juneteenth is an expression of Africans being upset because they told us too late that slavery was over. That's the wrong thing to be upset about, it seems to me. I mean, how can you be too late in saying slavery was over? How can you, I mean, the crime of the enslavement of African people is the real issue that we're dealing with. And in the thing on Bloody Sunday, you know, there's a tendency to treat events like this as just something happened in the past that validates the progress, quote unquote, that we've made today. So Bloody Sunday is this example, and look how how far we've come, you know, and that's bogus. And the thing is that nothing has changed. And the violence of this system is no different today than it was in Selma, Alabama, when they attacked people on that Pettus Bridge. And I think that that's the lesson that has to be taught. And it's easy for the government and everybody to come out and support the celebration and the commemoration of Bloody Sunday. But it wouldn't be easy to support it if it were expressed as an example of colonial terror and the existence of African people living under colonial domination today, and how we still got to deepen this struggle and organize African people so that we can make this revolution and take it out of the hands of the African petty bourgeoisie that was satisfied with some civil rights, while the basic rights of African people as to be free have still not been achieved. So I just think that's part of what we talked about, this way that people come into political life and political existence today, use their presence today to satisfy the historical requirements of African people to be free. It's not happened yet. So you can have all kinds of celebrations. People come out and they dust off Malcolm X. You know, every February people dust off Malcolm and bring him out and got good pictures of him. And every August there's Marcus Garvey we're going to talk about. And then after that it's all over again. And then we spend part of February talking about Black history. That's over again. And now we go to this thing. And so they give us a Martin Luther King Boulevard and a Martin Luther King celebration. We do all of that kind of stuff. And all of that stuff keeps us from achieving total liberation, and we have to do that. And this is a very vicious social system, and America is the headquarters, and Hillary Clinton is one of the most vicious imperialist forces we've ever seen. And what we've seen is just feminist imperialism. What the hell difference does it make if it's feminist imperialism, or heterosexual imperialism, or homosexual imperialism, or you know, what difference does it make? It's imperialism, it's colonialism that that dominates our lives. And to hold up this vicious pig in Hillary Clinton. I mean, you know, the Clinton man from Arkansas, just as an example, they ain't call him Slick Willie. The people who knew him call him Slick Willie. That's her husband, right, in Arkansas. But when they used these forces to overthrow Mobutu, and they marched through Congo, and a mining company specifically tied to Arkansas, and this is Clinton in power, tied to Arkansas, was following the military, along with the military, signing contracts with whomever they can get to sign a contract for mining rights all over Congo. I mean, this is what we're talking about. And of course, Hillary celebrates the murder that she orchestrated, a participant orchestrated of Muammar Gaddafi. I mean, this is, you know, and then holding her up. And of course, what happens is holding her up is versus Donald Trump. And I can't even tell the difference in the two of them, except one of them is taller. But, you know, you know, yeah, yeah. Anyway.
Uhuru. There's a question that says, Uhuru, I really appreciate this question. And I know probably, well, in the next few weeks, we'll be really going into this and organizing around this question. But the question is, Uhuru, how will current declaration of democratic support for reparations amongst Democratic candidates affect working class Africans in the U.S.? And that's from Langston.
How does this discussion around reparations?
Yeah, in the Democratic.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Langston, because it's something that we've been talking about in, you know, within other formations that the party is involved in, one of which is the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. But as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of people don't understand this whole trajectory, this whole fight around the reparations question. And as I said, in 1979, I think we put the reparations issue on the 14-point platform of the African People's Socialist Party. And then in 1982, we organized the first tribunal for reparations that ever occurred. And we had 12 others all around this country because we wanted to make it a popular demand. In 1983, I traveled first to London, England, participating in a massive anti-colonial type book fair, if you will, where that was attended by Africans, not only in England, but from throughout the world, including, I can't think of his brother's Baba's name. He was once the, I think, prime minister, or played some really important role in the government of Tanzania, although he was not Tanzanian born, as I understand it. But who was asking, you know, tell me about the reparations question. So that's what we took. We took the reparations demand. We took a book that we had written on reparations there. I traveled throughout Europe. I went to Northern Ireland, where the Irish were involved in the struggle at the time against the British, and won the Irish Republican Socialist Party to come out in solidarity with the demand for reparations. And this was important at that time because in this country, the Irish were functioning as vicious attackers of black people, especially in Boston and some other places in this country. And the Irish Republican Socialist Party had a press conference standing in solidarity with demand for reparations and declaring that they wanted no money, no resources, because the Irish Republican effort was being funded a lot by Irish who live inside the United States, even Kennedys and what have you. Irish, they were sending money, people were sending money to this struggle against, they weren't publicly doing that, but publicly politicians and others were sending money, but they were not always publicly doing that. And so we did that. The day after our meeting, the government burned down the headquarters of the Irish Republican Socialist Party as a statement of the significance of that. And so we took that everywhere. There were others who worked around the reparations question. They did it differently than we did. They understood it differently than we did, but our objective was to turn it into a mass demand. Because if it's a mass demand, that's the thing that puts pressures on governments. The work that we did and initiated resulted in some of the people who worked hard for the Durban South African United Nations event. What year was that, Chimamanda? 2001. That's right, 2001. That Durban effort where the United Nations declared reparations were due to African people, we influenced that. And so my point is that, and taking it to the masses was the critical thing. That's the thing that puts pressure. And so we have this crisis now of imperialism, the crisis of a social system in this country where the body politic of this country is fracturing in such a serious way that Donald Trump has succeeded in capturing the white vote in this country. The Republican Party, as characterized by many as the white man's party, that's what you're looking at. So you've got any place from a third to perhaps sometime as high as 40% of the electorate tied to Donald Trump and I guess the Republican Party on the one hand. And now the Democrats are now struggling to, and they're not just struggling because they're opposed to Trump as an individual, but also the whole Atlanticist bloc. All of that stuff is being disrupted by Trump. So the Democrats are now struggling to win political power and influence, a sector of the bourgeoisie, and in order to do that, they got to mobilize Africans, Mexicans, and other people like that. That's why you see huge amounts of money being spent to get African women to run for political office, to get African people to run for political office, to get African people to run as district attorneys, to do all of this other kind of stuff. And this function as a kind of a steam relief valve so that black people can find, oh, we can talk about this now inside the Democratic Party. You don't leave the Democratic Party to fight for reparations. You can fight for reparations in the Democratic Party. And so this becomes a substitute for a genuine struggle. But it didn't just happen. They did it because they thought it was a good idea one day. They did it because masses of people are finally attracted to the question of reparation, because the African People's Socialist Party has for decades been engaged in actual concrete work and achieving reparations. It's no longer just an idea. If you go to 4101 West Florissant Street in St. Louis today, you see the consequence of reparations. You can see that in various places where we operate as a party, reparations are coming in. And so we say they open the door and put it on on the, for the next 2 years at least, you're going to hear a debate around reparations. They are trying to take the demand to win African people, collectivize African people against the Trump sector of the bourgeoisie, Trump-aligned sector of the bourgeoisie, by using African people. And so we say, right on. Now you open the door. Now the work that we were doing that used to be characterized as a lunatic fringe is now center stage. So we take it, and we don't just go by what they said. We take reparation to the masses of the people. We define it to the masses of the people, so that the next time African happens to rob a filling station or do this or that, any efforts that African people are making against white power to achieve resources now can be put in the context of a fight for reparations. It is ours. And that's where we unleash the masses of people everywhere. We don't have to accept the Democratic Party definition of it. We can raise it in an electoral process. We can put forth initiatives. We can do like they did in Chicago and come up with this, this ordinance for the slavery, what is it called? The slavery disclosure ordinance, and like they did in Chicago, where every corporation has to say something about, show the history that they have with slavery. We can take it further, and we can demand that reparations come from these corporations. We can say every city that we live in, everywhere in the world, has benefited from the oppression and exploitation of African people. So we say, right on, that's what it means. Not the Democratic Party is not going to do a damn thing for us, but they've been forced to open the door. We have forced them to discuss the question. Once they take it to that platform to discuss it, it's up to us to do our work to take it back from them. Uhuru.
This question comes from Comrade Raya Fogarty of the African People's Solidarity Committee in St. Louis. Says, Uhuru Chairman, could you speak to how J. Edgar Hoover, getting his start in the counterinsurgency against the Garvey movement when he was 22 or so years old, the military defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, and how under his leadership created the definitions and protocols that are still carried out today against the African and indigenous anti-colonial revolutionary movements?
I do think it's important to recognize this. It's what I was saying in part, that they might not call it counterinsurgency today, but the war against the colonized peoples of the world and in this country has been ongoing, because you cannot keep a people subjugated under the terms that we contend with today without using various forms of brutality, subterfuge, oppression, etc. And Hoover, who was the first executive director of what has now come to be known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is the domestically based secret political police in this country, cut his teeth attacking the Garvey movement. In fact, the FBI was integrated. First African brought into the FBI was brought there for the purpose of being able to infiltrate into the Garvey movement. That's their statement too, something about how the success of the African petty bourgeoisie comes at the expense of the African working class, the masses of African workers, because that Negro became an FBI agent so that, because he could, for the objective of penetrating the Garvey movement. Of course, Hoover had a lot of help with people who were not formerly FBI agents, who were also Negroes, like W.E.B. Du Bois and like the guy who is characterized as being this great communist, Cyril Briggs, who was the formal nominal head of the African Blood Brotherhoods, which was a front for the Communist Party, and that wrote in there that after they could not take over the Garvey movement, initiated or participated in a vicious attack on them. So that is a part of the whole counterinsurgency efforts of the Garvey movement. Is where Hoover cut his teeth, and he played the role. He used the guy's name was William Sullivan. Sullivan was Hoover's right-hand man, right-hand person, who created the COINTELPRO program. And he is also the person who was used by Hoover to help create the so-called war on drugs as they initiate, and it first went into Southeast Asia. He was, Hoover played a really important role, and they defined us in a fashion, and our struggle in a fashion. Even the language Hoover used in this setting the goals for the counterinsurgency program, the counterintelligence programs against African people is very insidious, and how it defines us as hate, some kind of hate groups, et cetera, because you don't want to be dominated by white power that makes you hateful. I hate, you damn right, I hate white power. And I hate all of its advocates and everybody who tries to uphold it, et cetera. And that's what makes me a black identity extremist. And that's how we are characterized, you know, et cetera. Uhuru. I'm sorry, I know, Raya, there was much more to that, and I didn't do justice to the question.
Uhuru. Well, just to remind everybody that there is a part 2 to this discussion as well that's going to be happening where, and in this chapter, it just really expounds on the whole, you know, counterinsurgency, the programs that have been used, and things like that. And we'll have much more time to address certain questions that don't get answered today. Because I know there's a lot. There was, I wanted to ask this one last question because I thought it was really important. And it's from Craig Rogers. Says, I have recently returned from Mexico and the city looks like a massive concentration camp. I live in Texas and consciously Dallas is in, and I don't know what this means or even if I'm pronouncing it right, cryogenic stasis. I don't know what that means.
That's what cryogenic, cryogenic. It's like when something is frozen, right? Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
It says, I agree wholeheartedly with this speech, but what are the immediate solutions an individual can use to subvert the oppression? I am aware it is on the individual to educate and liberate his mind, but what are practical things she can do to be an immediate influence?
Thank you. There's a couple of things. One, I want to speak first to Minnie Jackson, who is watching and this study, participating in this study. Sister Minnie, we miss you. We need you. You got to call me, call us, because Sister Minnie was handling the distribution of our burning spear and other stuff for a long period of times, and she is the one who really made the struggle when the prisons wouldn't let the newspaper in. Sister Minnie was the one who fought and got those newspapers in. Sister Minnie, we don't know how you did that. And they're not letting the burning spear get into too many prisons, and we need your help, your advice, your assistance in overcoming this problem. And so please get in touch so that, and we love you even if you don't do it. All right. So, you know, it's really difficult to talk about what individuals can do because our strength is in organization. And individuals who function as parts of organization are the individuals who have some kind of power, some kind of influence, but it's extremely difficult to do it otherwise. And if you are an individual who is in Dallas, Texas, trying to make something happen, you should be contacting the individuals who are in Houston, Texas, and other places who are part of the party, part of the Uhuru movement, so that you don't have to try to deal with this thing by yourself on an individual level, so we can have a collective response to what's happening. I appreciate the question, and I know there are many individuals who are raising this kind of question, and sometimes people are reluctant to come into organization, but that is our solution. In Garvey, people who know us know Marcus Garvey, and they know how Marcus Garvey recognized that organization is the only power that an oppressed people have. And so that's what we have to do. We have to be organized and contact us. There's contact information that's available to you on the site that you are experiencing this study on right now. Uhuru.
Yes, Uhuru, and I just want to encourage people who are watching from Houston, in the southern region, right now, with everybody throughout our party who's watching, and see people who are interested in joining. And I'm going to talk about how people are interested in joining the African Socialist Party. I'll be mentioning that in a moment, but you know, we will be reaching out to forces who are on the live and making sure that the chairman, because of time, that we do see your questions, your comments, and that you are responded to, including information about, you know, where we are located, how you can join, how you can get involved. So as mentioned, because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question wasn't answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. We've extended our fund drive for another week to meet our $7,000 goal to keep the station on the airwaves, so we're calling on all of you to contribute to your radio station. You can donate to blackpower96.org/donate or call 1-888.
We never tell the people how much we raise, how much they need to donate to get to 7,000. There might be some out of there right now ready to donate the whole $7 grand if that's what we need, but.
I don't have that number with me. Yeah. But from the last time I checked, we were over 60% of our goal, which was, we had 4,300. But that was earlier last week, so I'm not sure what came in, over the course of the week. But you can, like I said, make your donations to blackpower96.org/donate or call 1-888-979-BP96. That's 1-888-979-2796. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Join the Freedom Mass Choir and Band. The Freedom Mass Choir and Band is an all-African community group of singers and instrumentalists that sing songs of resistance and revolution. Members are located throughout the United States and attend weekly rehearsals both in person and via live stream and video. Sign up by emailing blackpowerchoir@gmail.com or call 727-537-6736. And a few announcements for Uhuru Foods and Pies. Uhuru Foods and Pies are selling delicious pies at the prestigious Mills College in Oakland. They have been the concessionaire for Ubuntu Theater for 4 consecutive weeks and will be there today. They want you to know that every Saturday at the Grand Lake Farmers Market in Oakland, California, Uhuru Foods and Pies sells African comfort food to a broad base of hungry supporters. They are looking for volunteers who seek purpose in their service. Look them up and follow them on their Facebook page at Uhuru Foods and Pies. It's going down in St. Louis. Black Power Poetry will be live, so come see the real creative genius of the African working class. The Black Power Blueprint is hosting an open mic in the house that Black built. Save the date, March 22nd at 7 p.m. in the St. Louis Aquaba Hall, located at 4101 West Florissant Ave. Black Power Poetry and open mic. For more information on this event or to sign up as an artist, you can email stlouis@apedf.org or call 314-380-0980. To learn more about the amazing project that is the Black Power Blueprint, visit blackpowerblueprint.org. On March 10th in St. Petersburg, Florida, join us for an evening with Chairman Omali Yeshitela, where we'll have an intimate discussion and screening of the documentary Chairman Omali Yeshitela at Oxford Union, The Africa Debate, celebrating the tremendous victory of Chairman at the Oxford Union, putting the theory of African internationalism on the world stage, taking place at 3 p.m. at 1245 Charon Lewis, or otherwise known as 18th Avenue South, right here at Aquaba Hall. On March 23rd and 24th, join the African National Women's Organization for their national plenary being held in St. Louis, Missouri. African women's role in the revolution is on the front lines, and ANWO helps us to understand this by showing its tremendous leadership of African women. Visit anwouhuru.org to learn more about this event. April 6th and 7th, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations will be conducting its 3rd electoral campaign school in St. Petersburg, Florida. Do you want to learn how to run for office on a revolutionary platform, such as the National Black Political Agenda for Self-Determination, and win? You don't want to miss this school. With speakers from the BIB Steering Committee, including Chairman himself, you can learn from the best. Visit blackisbackcoalition.org for more info on the electoral campaign school. The movement for white solidarity with Black power is growing. Witness it at the Uhuru Solidarity National Convention April 13th and 14th in St. Louis, Missouri. Come see the growth of white reparations to African people and learn the role that white people can play in creating a future free of oppression. Visit uhurusolidarity.org to learn more about this convention. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, at burningspearmarketplace.com. This book is the political report to the 7th Congress and features a foreword from ASI Secretary General Loezi Kinshasa, as well as international solidarity statements from anti-colonial, anti-imperialist organizations existing around the world. And you can book Chairman Omali Yeshitela for the Vanguard 2019 International Speaking Tour by contacting info@omaliyeshitela.org or call 727-914-3621. Sign up for the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise. The Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise is the annual fundraiser held to support the work of the African Socialist International. The African Socialist International is an organization made up of African people located virtually on every continent, dedicated to overturning the conditions faced by African people worldwide. This year's cruise will be taking place from December 14th to 19th, 2019, and will be sailing on the Carnival Sunrise from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, staying overnight in Havana, Cuba, and visiting Nassau, Bahamas. Join us for a 5-day trip filled with on and off-board activities such as live games and contests, nightclubs, spas, swimming pools, etc., and political education with the chairman. Registration is now open and deposits can be made by calling the travel agent Linda Stern at 732-972-4171. If you want to further support the ASI and the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, make a donation by visiting uhurulegacycruise.org. If you're local to St. Louis, at the Uhuru House, 4 p.m. Central, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement will be hosting their Black Power Sunday rally, raising important concerns and community issues and organizing to overturn them. If you're local, come on down to 4101 West Florissant Avenue. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, and catch us back in an hour on our newly launched YouTube page, Uhuru Congo, at 11 a.m. Eastern, to hear reports on the situation happening in Congo right now, featuring the chairman and ASI Secretary General Loezi Kinshasa. Thank you all, comrades. Uhuru!